It should come as no surprise, especially to the regular viewers of this channel, that myself and Bachmann, well, really don't get along that well. Especially as of late. And the sad thing is, I used to be a hardcore Bachmann fanatic. I used to love their models because, yes, they were cheap, but the prices were cheap. Not to mention they offered a very hardcore and comprehensive warranty that basically covered you all around. So I could live with the malfunctions and imperfections if it meant I was getting good value for money. And like any relationship gone bad, there are several reasons for this deterioration, namely the fact that the quality in these engines has not gone up but gone down pretty much through the floor, and the prices have rocketed through the stratosphere. Not exactly a good combination to have in this day and age, although admittedly inflation does play a role here. There was, however, an age about 10 years ago now where Bachmann was pushing its prices through the floor in an effort to help take out its competition, specifically that of model power and its newly developed sound line of locomotives. These locomotives were again sub $200 priced and basically were low-hanging fruit for Bachmann to grab. Model Power, by this point in 2014, had already gone bust and was actually bought out by MRC, the company providing the sound decoders for its inexpensive line of sound-equipped locomotives. MRC was developing a new type decoder that was supposed to revolutionize model railroading called the Loco Genie. Check out my video on that, I'll put a link of it in the description. That would allow model railroaders to run a locomotive basically on analog power with full control of the DCC and sound controls via fully functioning standalone wireless remote control that actually worked on a radio signal, not via Bluetooth as in with the Bachmann products. But unlike the Bachmann systems of the time, be able to become fully functional in terms of a DCC and sound engine when placed on a DCC and sound layout. What made these engines again so attractive is all of this was available for under $200. Unfortunately, there were a lot of flaws with this plan. Essentially, Model Power and MRC were two drunks trying to drag themselves across the finish line. MRC's DCC and sound decoders, while they had improved tremendously in terms of their reliability, still had an albatross for being highly unreliable decoders and thus a name for such. And the models coming out of Model Power, well, were just plain prehistoric. This model here, for example, we're looking at is a GP20 developed by the Mantua Manufacturing Company all the way back in the 60s, Model Power having acquired this design back in the early 2000s. And Bachmann had a brand new weapon in its arsenal to go up against these particular models. Enter its line of sound value locomotives. Introduced in 2013, these models were originally set to retail at around $200, something around the price of an Atlas RS3. Of course, those models were much higher quality than these ever could imagine to be. However, when Bachmann realized it could easily take out Model Power and with new recently acquired capacity via the Sandokan plant it bought out, the company decided to start a price war. It flooded the market with these sound value equipped engines to the point where prices to retailers dropped to where you could find these brand new off the shelf at your local hobby shop or an online retailer. Again, that's a DCC and sound equipped locomotive for less than $150, let alone $200. In addition, these models had the advantage of being designed brand new, which meant they lacked the massive pilot holes, for example on the MRC locomotives and other such crude details. Yes, they use wheel wipers much like the MRC products did, Model Power MRC products I should say at this point, but they still were a better product in terms of their detailing despite being somewhat crude compared to the prehistoric monsters that Model Power were pushing out. The mechanics of these particular models were extremely crude, again in an effort to keep prices as low as possible. Workmanship was also not great either. All that's keeping this worm gear in place is an undermount piece of plastic, and all that's securing the truck is that dog dish underneath the metal mount. And of course, metal against plastic can only spell trouble in the long run. The worm gears don't even have covers on them, making it a real possibility to get dirt and or for them to be damaged in the event of an accident. I can't imagine this particular model would last very long, especially in the hands of a less experienced model railroader. The decoder in this case, which is a DCC ready variant that I'm showing you, or DCC equipped variant as they basically were the same, simply has a standard easy command decoder plugged in on it. That's all Bachmann did to make this locomotive work on DCC from the factory. Now, while the electronics on the DCC ready and equipped versions of these particular locomotives were crude, fortunately the same could not be said for the sound equipped variations of these models. In addition to the detailing, these locomotives featured Soundtraxx sound decoders, essentially the cat's pajamas, if you will, of sound decoders at the time. Soundtraxx was the company to go to if you wanted a DCC and sound-equipped engine that sounded realistic and ran well, in sharp contrast to the junk MRC was shoving in their models. Even if the tsunami decoder being used by Soundtraxx in this locomotive was essentially a precursor to the company's soon-to-be-developed economy, removing such sound effects as the startup and shutdown sequence, the wheels or flange squeal around tight curves, and the coupler clank. MRC, after being taken over during this period itself, would finally concede that the model power investment wasn't working, and would then license model power out to Lionel, who would in turn use these models to help reintroduce its line of HO scale models, in addition to some models it had produced itself. While it is easy to nitpick Bachmann's products of this time, and particularly because they found all the weak points in pretty much every layout due to their crude wheel wiper pickup systems and the fact that even the Soundtraxx decoders themselves still ran on a 32nm process, which roughly translates into a processor that needs more power than today's chips and produces more heat, and thus is more sensitive to power fluctuations, I was able to forgive it most of these problems at the time. Why? Because they were so darn cheap. I was able to get this engine in its previous incarnation, please note I have modified this and I'll go into that, for about $110 back in the day. And at that price, even I couldn't complain. I mean, that's awesome. This is what Bachmann was known for, giving you crazy value for money, and yeah, not having perfect quality, but making it so inexpensive that you were willing to just basically deal with it for the sake of getting that product. And while I could forgive it all of those flaws, the fact of the matter is this was a cheap but not so cheerful locomotive. As we can see, the locomotive is basically able to find every possible calamity on my layout, finding every possible chance, that is to say, to derail and or stall, and or who knows what else.
What the heck? Holy electrical malfunctions, Batman. It's off the track again. You're not gonna believe this. So I can't even make it through a switch, apparently. I mean...
Now, all of this would have probably been okay if the prices had remained how they were. However, that was not to be. As I mentioned before, MRC gave up on model power, and the company soon ceased to exist as a model train provider of DCC and sound-equipped locomotives for this price range. Bachmann, smelling blood, promptly jacked the price up steadily on these models. From 2014 all the way up to 2016, the prices from these locomotives steadily rose until they reached a whopping $249. Wow! Way above what it would cost to get an Atlas locomotive at the time. Although, to be fair, these locomotives were still DCC equipped already. We were still a year away from Atlas reintroducing its own model of the RS3 with factory installed DCC and sound, in this case provided by ESU's locomotive system. And unfortunately, following Bachmann's trend of keeping the price down at all costs and or improving its profit margin at all costs, the mechanics of this locomotive were further cheapened at this time, with cheaper motors installed and even worse workmanship being utilized.
Oh, it's actually stuck again. I mean... Does this thing ever work? Does it do anything else but crap out? Oh, yeah, I've had enough messing with this thing. I'm just done. Sorry, folks. That's... I think you get the idea. This is not the best built unit ever, to put it mildly.
And I do most certainly concur with this gentleman's assessment, and not just because he happens to be, well, myself. Then, earlier this year, it was announced that there'd be a new variant of the Bachmann Sound Value RS3, this time equipped with the TCS WowSound system, as well as its Keep Alive technology. And here, finally, is the product in question. As we see to start with, first impressions aren't anything overwhelming. The same usual standard off-the-shelf, run-of-the-mill Bachmann packaging. No thrills, nothing here to look at, folks. Move along, move along, move along. I would also like to take this opportunity to point out that this product is for people 14 years and up. In addition to the age disclaimer, we also get the usual propaganda, in this case, about Bachmann's Easy Command system, which I might add is turned about 10 years old now if I remember correctly. To avoid having you pass out and fall asleep in your chairs watching at home, I'm going to go ahead and just expedite the removal of the locomotive from the packaging. Again, there isn't very much to be seen here. Again, a hard clamshell plastic cover with a little cellophane wrap to protect the locomotive inside. Very cheaply done. As is typical with most Bachmann locomotives, in particular in the Sound Value Edition, there is again just simply one prototype followed for all the various different road names. I believe this locomotive in real life has a steam generator stack, or at least had a steam generator stack. As we can see, it doesn't have that. It also had dual horns. Again, this unit only has the single horn. The colors are very vibrant and do stick out, but that's about all it has to show for itself. Another issue is the way this locomotive is actually numbered. New Haven locomotives always had a 0 preceding the actual road number of the locomotive itself. As we can see here, it just has the number 543 on all sides, with no 0 in place. Another unfortunate oversight is the fact that the number boards on the locomotive itself are not illuminated. This is again typical of the economy type locomotives Bachmann builds in this line. The headlight, however, does appear to be correct, as the single sort of, I believe it is filament bulb that would have been used back in the 50s. Turning our attention to the smokestack, I believe that's in the correct location as it simulates a water-cooled turbocharger being installed. Again, the air-cooled turbochargers were lengthwise on Alcos, whereas the water-cooled turbochargers had their stacks going across or widthwise. It's more of the same on the opposite side of the locomotive. Again, the locomotive lacks the little step in front of the door. Not a big oversight, but still one to be noted. Turning our attention to below the locomotive, as we noted before, the speaker area is actually smaller on the TCS equipped locomotives than it is on the Soundtraxx ones, as we can see here by the vent and grill area where the speaker is mounted behind. There isn't much to write home about, if you will, on underbody detail. The trucks themselves do appear to be a little bit more three-dimensional. It looks like Bachmann made an attempt to spiff them up. And in yet another note of say hello to the new boss, same as the old, Bachmann is still employing wheel wipers to pick up power from the wheels and transfer that power to the electrical system. And yet again, much like all the previous editions of the Bachmann Sound Value locomotives, most of the detail parts are simply molded into the plastic. Really, the only thing that's separately applied appears to be the handrails on the side of the locomotive and, of course, the couplers, which I might add are spring-loaded. The only other exceptions to the basic rule of having all of the details molded into the plastic are the brake wheel located on the front of the engine and that extra uncoupling rod located on the front of the porch railing. And that's going to do it for the basic overlook of the outside of the locomotive. Now let's take a look at all the documentation that came with the engine. As usual, we get the obligatory start guide, showing you how to operate the DCC sound system on this particular locomotive. A note, it does not have the standard TCS commands. Bachmann messed with them. So those of you with TCS WowSound will need to sort of relearn your commands to operate this engine, and only for this engine, just to make things annoying. Of course, there's the obligatory parts diagram showing all the different parts, which you'll most likely need to order since, again, the drivetrain underneath this locomotive is essentially the same, which is why you'll note I will not be disassembling this locomotive to show it off, because there really isn't much here to see except for the TCS soundboard, which looks a little bit different. The only other exception is a cheaper motor, again being used to substitute for the higher quality one that was used in previous variants of the Sound Value Edition locomotives. Other than that, really not much to go on here. Moving along to the rest of the documentation included with the locomotive, we have the warranty statement. Again, this unit comes with a 1-year warranty from Bachmann in case of any defects. It has to be registered, I believe, to actually be able to redeem warranty work. Another oddity put into this particular decoder is that audio assist has been completely removed, so if you want to make any adjustments to the locomotive's performance, sound, lighting, etc., it will need to be done manually with the good old-fashioned commands, aka CVs. Well, that's enough of all that jabber. Let's get into the actual operations of this locomotive. To start with, again, this locomotive is equipped with TCS's WowSound system with Keep Alive, and just to demonstrate, there it is, running completely off the track with no power being added to it whatsoever. Again, the Keep Alive capacitor is able to keep the engine running essentially if you hit a bad section of track, so you don't get the infamous stuttering that readily annoys model railroaders, especially with older layouts and or on less, well, shall we say, maintained or clean track. Now let's discuss the various sound features of the engine. We'll start with the startup sequence. A huge improvement considering the previous version didn't even have a startup sequence. Now let's hear the shutdown sequence. Now for the bell and the horn. Short horn. The railroad crossing horn sequence, as we call it. Five again activates the brakes. Function 10 opens a valve. Function 11 closes the valve. Function 12 is your coupler clank. That essentially does it for the functions on this locomotive. While it's still not fully functioned in terms of its sound effects, it's a huge improvement over the original Sound Value Edition. Since the majority of the locomotive is essentially a holdover from the previous generation RS3 with Sound Value Edition, the real star of the show of this review is going to be the TCS Sound DCC and Sound decoder with its Keep Alive technology. Each of these decoders, for example, has a whopping 30 minutes of actual sound files recorded for each particular prime mover. This gives you the engine many more options to respond to throttle inputs, such as several throttle transitions. This is to say, if the engine is speeding up from a certain notch or speeding down from a certain notch, you will hear a specific sound for that specific transition. Another unique feature built into this decoder is the auto-notching system, marketed by TCS as Proto Notch. Admittedly, this is not as unique as it sounds, to at least when first mentioned, as companies like ESU WowSound have been cranking these out for a while now, that basically match up the throttle settings right to the locomotive's motion. However, TCS takes this to another notch. For example, let's say you're taking your locomotive up a grade. The locomotive will increase the throttle settings to match the engine being strained as it fights to get up the hill, without you having to actually change throttle settings, and without changing throttle settings. Once the engine comes off the grade, the throttle settings will then return back to the way they were before, or reduce depending upon what the situation calls for. Again, all of these sound manipulations occur via the decoder, simulating all of the excitement of the train climbing the grade without the actual end user having to mess with manual notching. Now, I may come off sounding like a fanboy of TCS sound effects. I know there are a lot of people who are really hardcore into ESU WowSound, count me as one of them. What truly converted me was the sheer amount of data and or memory dedicated to the various different sound effects these decoders possess for various different situations, such as throttling the engine up, throttling it down, going up the grades, specific situations of throttle being inputted from a dead stop, for example, not to mention the great momentum control in the brake simulation system, which works very well, which I'll get into in a little bit here. But the main item that drew me toward these decoders was the Keep Alive system, allowing for smooth as butter operations even over extremely rough sections of track with no hesitation, stalling, etc. And as we can see by the way this locomotive has been running so far, the TCS Keep Alive system really pays its dues. The locomotive so far, after shifting around all the weak points in my yard, has not stalled once or even hesitated. That in itself, in my opinion, before we get to the other features, makes this whole system worthwhile. We also know the locomotive is tracking much better than the previous generation Bachmann, Sound Value Edition RS3. The locomotive sound effects speak for themselves, or sound for themselves. See what I did there? Okay, I'll stick to my day job. Joking aside, the wide variety of sound effects for very specific situations that this decoder can produce just can't simply be ignored. And it really makes this thing pop. And now let's discuss the incredible momentum system built into the WowSound decoders. We started with the engine set at a high throttle setting, and now as you see from that picture, I'll throttle back to 0. And now let's throttle up again. Notice how the engine took its time slowing down and simulated each throttle reduction along the way. Also notice that when the engine throttled up, the engine came to the proper throttle setting at each notch, simulating the engineers slowly but surely throttling from notch 0 all the way up to notch 8. Mind you, this test was done with mainline momentum engaged. Look at the instructions as to which function to hit to activate it, and again this can be triggered from your remote control. Now the next question is, well, how do you stop a train from mainline momentum? Well, you use the brake, as I will demonstrate now by pressing the F5 key after throttling the engine down from full throttle. Notice the realistic brake flange squeal when the engine was stopped. Also note the let-off effect when the engine was throttled up again from the stop, simulating the brakes being taken off. While this function is available on the locomotive system, I find it works much better out of the box on the TCS systems. Again, this locomotive is running without any tuning whatsoever. It was just literally put on the tracks. Now let's do another fast to slow run again and see how the engine responds to the throttle inputs. The sound effects are nothing short of breathtaking, and the locomotive's ability to track is actually much improved from the previous model, although it appears all Bachmann did was simply go back and adjust the wheel sets by making minor tweaks to them. And please note for this next part that car the excavator is traveling on is in fact a full metal die-cast car from Model Power, adding to the weight of the train. Note again how the locomotive simulates the strain of the engine going up the hill by increasing the sound effects. Mind you, the throttle settings are remaining the same, and so is the speed. The pulling, or should I say in this case the pushing power of this locomotive was quite good as well. I've gotten better engines, don't get me wrong, that can push heavier loads up, like the most recently acquired Shark that I demonstrated in my most recent locomotive review, but this isn't bad for what it is. Also note that the engine was able to creep across the switches without any hesitation or power cutouts whatsoever. This is a true showcase of the Keep Alive system's ability to keep the engine going and to maintain a very smooth and enjoyable experience when running trains over rough sections of track. Overall, the locomotive handled the mountain very well, and very impressive at that, if not mostly for the TCS WOW system and its sound effects. Not to mention the Keep Alive system that just kept this engine going through pretty much every possible weak point in the track system on the mountain. This is particularly impressive considering the amount of switches I have in that yard. Anyway, that'll do it for mainline running. Now let's get these containers over to Midville Yard in their final destination. Now let's see how this locomotive handles the 15-inch curves around the yard engine house. And as you can see, no trouble at all with those tight 15-inch curves. And as we can also see, not the slightest bit of hesitation over any of my annoying old school switches whatsoever, including those infamous curved ones. Now I will make one concession, and some of the more observant of you certainly have noticed it. If you look closely at the snowplows of the locomotive, the two tips are now white, and the reason is I've basically removed the footboards. The reason being is they were bottoming out on all of my switches. Now I'm sure of at least some of you will probably criticize me for doing this, but there are a few good reasons. A, the locomotive is not practical if it can't actually make it through my switch points. And admittedly, again, manufacturers like Atlas keep these included and don't bottom out, so I don't know why these engines always do. This is also a problem I might have with the previous generation of sound value RS3s. And B, the fact of the matter is, for the era of my model railroad set up in the sort of the late 80s, early 90s, these footboards have been long outlawed by the actual Federal Railroad Administration, which meant in real life they would have had to have been removed anyway. So I can definitely swallow that. And just to prove just how proficient the TCS Keep Alive system is, let's take this locomotive down a siding which I know is very dirty and known for having conductivity problems, at least at the current moment. Mind you, I'm planning to overhaul these sidings in the near future with nickel silver track. These were on the bottom of the priority list as they were not on the main line. And I have already started doing this process, but again, time has been getting in my way, and I've had to make priorities. And as we can see again, no hesitation whatsoever through the switches.
Turn switch again.
As we know right here on this particular switch, while trimming the footboard certainly drastically helped the locomotive out, it still did not completely solve the problem. There are still some weird points where this engine somehow manages to get hooked on switch motors. I don't know exactly why this happens, but it's only this particular locomotive, and of course its older siblings from the Sound Value RS3 line that Bachmann produces. Not sure exactly what the deal is here, if it was just some bizarre attention to detailing. Whatever the case, as you can see, it's easy enough to get it through. I just simply have to take a slightly quicker run at it. But again, it's only that switch and other weird points. Strange. Well, this locomotive's day is done. Time to shut her down. And of course, now it's time for me to come to a conclusion with this locomotive. Well, before we get to the price, I must say that I was very impressed with this locomotive. Again, I'll say that again. I was very impressed with this locomotive, and yes, it's a Bachmann. The TCS sound system did a great job in working around all the flaws that these engines had in terms of their pickup systems, and some of the quality control issues apparently were tackled. However, this doesn't change the fact that the drivetrain is still built down to a price, and I don't doubt that this locomotive will cause major issues after it's gotten some mileage put underneath its wheels, as again, the parts are not all that high quality and are not really meant to last. They are meant to be built to a price and to keep a value point, and that's it. The TCS sound system, on the other hand, is a different story, much higher quality. The sound is mind-boggling. The Keep Alive system keeps the engine running smooth. Now, I'm sure the next question on everyone's mind is exactly how much does this engine cost? And while I'm sure people were expecting prices to come up, this might come as a shock. And no, you haven't seen wrong. It's in fact $349 to get one of these RS3s. To put that in perspective, that's how much a new Rapido DCC and Soundtraxx locomotive is. Now, I'm sorry, a lot of people criticize me for being hard on Bachmann for things like this, like high prices, etc. But there's no way you're going to tell me that this engine is in any way near on par with a Rapido DCC and Soundtraxx locomotive. And yes, they've been having quality control problems too. But I'm sorry, you cannot compare Rapido with Bachmann. That's like comparing an old rusted-out Hyundai, or in this case I should say a newer Hyundai, with a Rolls-Royce. There is no comparison, period. They are on two completely different levels. And yes, the DCC and sound system by TCS has drastically helped things out, and yes, there have been some attempts to fix the quality control issues, and yes, Bachmann has seemingly corrected all of the rail holding issues that the previous generation model had. But the detailing, the performance in general, in terms of the mechanics, all those other details are not on par with what a Rapido engine is, even if it has quality control problems, and therefore that price is not warranted in my humble opinion. Now, all of that said, I didn't, of course, spend that much. I found mine at trainworld.com for about $209, and with discounts I was able to get this for $219 with the taxes shipped to me all said and done. That's much more reasonable, but even then, that's pushing the price of what an Atlas DCC and Soundtraxx engine is, although while the Atlas is much better in terms of its mechanics, and the detailing certainly is better than the Bachmann's, if not as good as the Rapidos, it does, in fact, lack the Keep Alive system which the Bachmann has. But one detail I cannot stress enough is that this locomotive is not worth $349. So bottom line, while I can recommend this locomotive, Bachmann really does need to beam back up to the mothership because that's essentially how high these prices have gone. And that's going to do it for this review. If you'd liked it, feel free to hit the like button. If not, hit the dislike button. Please subscribe as it helps me very much. And as always, keep the metal side down. Oh, I almost forgot to mention how I modified the first generation Sound Value Edition RS3. Well, in case any of you are wondering where the heck I managed to get a New York Central paint-schemed locomotive with Sound Value installed, I didn't. This was originally a CP rail locomotive, which I simply dropped a shell on top of from a DCC ready model.